Dateline Toronto. In a way, it's North America's 21st century metropolis. A growing transit network, increasing density, tons of cultural diversity, which makes it all the more shocking that it's also home to this. All about Highway 401, purportedly the world's busiest freeway, and what it teaches us about how to understand freeways and why we keep making the same mistakes with them. Coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer suggested topics always welcome, and look, I just went ahead and did a search for 401 in the comments tab of my analytics portal, just to see if I had people asking for this topic, and well, yeah. You know, if there's one thing I've learned from doing this channel, it's that the only thing people seem to enjoy more than having me sing the praises of their city is me just absolutely napalming some clearly awful part of it. And you know, Highway 401 is actually something I've had on my idea list ever since I ran across this claim when I was researching my Toronto to Montreal high-speed rail video. I kind of backburnered it, and I did have an idea around investigating the claim that Highway 401 is in fact the busiest freeway in the world. But it looks like there was a local newscast segment that kind of already did it in 2 minutes instead of my customary 15. And honestly, that angle just wasn't that interesting to me. I mean, what was going to be the takeaway? Congratulations, Toronto, for taking a pretty terrible idea and somehow making it even more odious. But still, something about this topic just gnawed at me. I knew there was a good video in there somewhere, so I did what every self-respecting creator does these days, which is I asked artificial intelligence. So according to Skynet, Highway 401 is huge, expensive, and extremely dangerous, which I think are all true. But then it editorializes that that's all good because a lot of commuters use it and it's critical to the economy. I just think it's funny that even AI ends up just regurgitating DOT type talking points. I guess even our robot overlords are vulnerable to Stockholm Syndrome. That was unhelpful, so the real impetus to today's video is just a good old human authored book. You see, I was reading The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, which I did enjoy and I do recommend. And the book itself is kind of tangential to today's topic, but there was one passage that stopped me in my tracks. In the chapter where he was talking about doctors' propensity to misdiagnose due to bad heuristics, Lewis focused on Sunnybrook Trauma Center in Toronto. And I'm just gonna read the passage because it's horrifying. It had started its life as a hospital for soldiers returning from the Second World War, but as the veterans died, its purpose shifted. In the 1960s, the government finished building what would become the most heavily used road in North America, and one of its busiest stretches passed close by the hospital. The carnage from Highway 401 gave the hospital a new life. Sunnybrook rapidly acquired a reputation for treating victims of automobile accidents. Leaving aside the word accident, which I don't love, this is kind of illuminating and sickening. And one of the researchers Lewis interviewed says this about deaths from crashes. 1.2 million deaths a year worldwide, one Japanese tsunami every day. Pretty impressive for a cause of death that was unheard of 100 years ago. Pretty dark. So today I'm using Highway 401 as sort of a case study to talk about the wisdom, or maybe lack thereof, of building massive freeways. And look, normally when I want to do a video on a specific location or a city, I like to go to that city and experience the thing I'm talking about firsthand. And I do want to go to Toronto soon, but what was I gonna do, like rent a car and drive on freeways all day? I'm willing to make sacrifices for this channel, but that's just going way too far. I was gonna do a section here about the historical background of Highway 401, how it was built and what people thought they were accomplishing when they built it, but it's really not that different from any other freeway origin story. Start out with a couple lanes, it gets filled up with demand from all the new suburban development that the highway enabled. Add a couple more lanes every decade or so, rinse and repeat. What's more interesting to me is the circular logic of building and expanding freeways like 401 and how we talk ourselves into it. You know, adding more lanes to solve traffic congestion is one of those things that comes off as common sense if you don't think about it very hard. I've talked about this in other videos, so I won't belabor it here, but the marginal value of a freeway lane declines with each one you add. So if you take it as a given that people just have to drive on freeways to get wherever it is they're gonna go, then the alternative to widening is just to keep building more freeways until your city looks like Dallas, I guess. The Greater Toronto area actually does have a parallel freeway you can use, and that's Highway 407, which runs parallel about 5 miles to the north. It is tolled, unlike the 401, which is interesting. Like, if you want to use the 407 to completely bypass the 401 through as much of the Greater Toronto area as you possibly can, which seems like a reasonable thing to want to do, it can run you like $70. Even more if you don't have a transponder. I kind of wonder, isn't the fact that it costs $70 to bypass Highway 401 basically an admission of failure? Like, the Ministry of Transportation is just flat out telling you that traveling on the 401 is really just this awful. Crashes, I was gonna dig into crash data, but Michael Lewis putting the entire province of Ontario on blast in a New York Times bestseller is probably sufficient. I will just leave you with the fact that if you Google news on Highway 401, which I did hoping to find coverage of different widening projects, the search results are just pretty graphic. All of which goes to one of the main points I want to make here, which is that there's a complete disconnect between how actual people experience Highway 401 and how public officials talk about it when they're trying to drum up support for another widening. It's particularly galling in the context of the most recently completed project, the $680 million Canadian widening from Mississauga to Milton. Check out this super authentic and not at all focus group tested language the ministry uses to promote the project. Widening Highway 401 is another step forward in our plan to reduce gridlock, improve economic productivity, and get drivers home to their loved ones faster. Well, at least they were honest and said that this specifically benefits drivers. BlogTO regurgitated the same soundbite and added this brilliant bit of editorializing. The population of the Greater Golden Horseshoe is forecast to grow from 10 million to 14.9 million people by 2051. That's a lot of cars to accommodate. As if it's inconceivable we should be trying to get those 5 million extra people to do anything but sprawl out into the suburbs and just drive everywhere. And I'm not going to read the whole EIS or whatever the Canadian equivalent of that is, but here's how they present the project benefits on the Infrastructure Ontario splash page. Community and green benefits: reduced traffic congestion, greenhouse gases and fuel consumption, improved quality of life for commuters by reducing daily travel time. I just want to know, are they going to do a before and after study to confirm that they did in fact reduce fuel consumption and greenhouse gases by doubling the number of freeway lanes? Just curious. Look, I'm not naive. I've been a consultant. I've done travel demand modeling and traffic analysis on projects like this, and I know what those tools do well and what they don't do well. They're very good at spitting out reasonable sounding and weirdly precise answers for things like forecast delay and travel time, but they kind of break down at larger scales. Conversely, the tools we have for things like forecasting how freeway capacity impacts more macro level things like land use, urban form, and livability are less convincing because those dynamics are just so much more complex. I mean, we talk about induced demand or induced driving a lot, and maybe what we should really be talking about is induced sprawl, which is a lot harder to quantify, but I think no less real a phenomenon. Okay, let's bring it back to crashes, which are notoriously hard to forecast, and our eyes kind of glaze over at the numbers anyway. But I just point out that there's literally a long-running Canadian TV reality show about tow truck companies that make their living off all the chaos that happens on Highway 401. I haven't seen this show and I don't intend to watch it, but I think I get the gist of it just from looking at the episode descriptions. So the argument you most often hear in favor of highway widening from state DOTs or provincial transportation ministries is what a great engine of regional prosperity a freeway is and how the local economy benefits. Well, when the most obvious direct economic beneficiaries are hospitals and tow truck companies, it's probably worth thinking a little harder about how the costs and benefits of freeway expansion get distributed. Okay, in a minute I'm going to zoom out and talk about the current state of freeway building in the US. But first, a brief reminder to drop a like on the video and subscribe and hit the bell unless you're like pro 1.2 million deaths a year. Well, actually the Undoing Project came out 6 years ago and the number's like 1.4 million now, so let's hear it for human progress. Connect on the apps if you care to, and direct support on Patreon is appreciated if you want to help me spread the controversial notion that over 1 million people being cut down in the prime of life every year is just not a good thing. You know, America used to be a great country, but if you've stayed with me this far, there can't be any denying that it's Canada that's leading the way when it comes to constructing transportation infrastructure that purportedly reduces fuel consumption and greenhouse gases and definitely supercharges the local tow truck and trauma center industries. The 401 is the biggest and the best. You kind of just have to tip your hat, but it's not as if Texas isn't trying. TxDOT is making nearly superhuman efforts to return the United States of America to a leadership position when it comes to building green transportation infrastructure. The Katy Freeway, recently widened, has around 50% more lanes than the 401, but it just doesn't carry quite as much traffic yet. Give it a few years though, and maybe it'll induce the climate-friendly land uses the greater Houston area is famous for. Although, you know, even if it runs at capacity, it still won't carry as many people as a single subway tube under the East River. But, subways are old tech, and they just don't give you the sense of freedom you get when you're sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic on a newly expanded interstate. Okay, this is grim stuff, and I understand that sometimes it feels like these decisions are being made by elected officials who are taking advice from old school state DOT engineer types and getting lobbied by large infrastructure consulting firms. That is actually what's happening. So as someone who has done planning and engineering on these kinds of projects, I can say with full confidence that you should not have to have a PE or a civil engineering degree to have a valid opinion on freeway widening. Civil engineering is pretty narrow in scope, and the question of what we want our cities to look like and what kind of travel we want to prioritize and invest in is not a civil engineering question. It's not a question you should be trying to answer by looking at how people travel today and just forecasting more of the same. That's not how policymaking should work. And if politicians are making investment decisions based on that kind of thinking, it's kind of governance malpractice. And that's all I got. Look, I have a laundry list of topic ideas around freeways, but man, I don't know how good it is for my mental health to be thinking about freeways all week. But let me know if you want more. I am a glutton for punishment. Thanks for letting me ruin your day today, and thanks as always to the patrons for supporting this rotating cast of Airbnb backdrops. Porto this week, who knows where next week, but Portugal content coming soon. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.